The invoice arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of February, and Harold Jennings read it twice before he picked up the phone. The service work had been routine: a pre-season inspection on his John Deere 7R290, oil and filter change, hydraulic fluid service, a front axle greasing that his hired man had missed on the fall maintenance cycle, and a minor electrical repair on the cab lighting system that had been intermittent since November. Harold had authorized the work verbally when he dropped the machine off the previous Monday. He had not been given a written estimate because he had not asked for one, because in 17 years of doing business with the Callaway John Deere dealership in Cooper County, Missouri, he had not found written estimates necessary for routine maintenance work. He knew the labor rate. He knew the parts pricing. He could estimate a pre-season inspection within a reasonable margin, and the invoice had always confirmed the estimate within a range that did not require discussion. This invoice did not confirm his estimate. His estimate, based on the labor rate he had been paying for the previous 18 months, $98 per hour, and the scope of work he had authorized, had been approximately $680. The invoice in his hand showed a labor charge of $847, which at the hours logged by the service technician implied a labor rate of $121 per hour. Harold checked the arithmetic twice. It was correct. He called Callaway Equipment. The service manager answered and confirmed, without particular apology, that the dealership had implemented a labor rate adjustment effective January 1st. The new rate was $121 per hour. Harold asked why he had not been informed of the change before the work was performed. The service manager said the rate change had been posted at the dealership and reflected on the current rate schedule available at the service counter. Harold said he had not been in the dealership since November and had not seen any posted notice. He said he would have appreciated a phone call or a letter notifying him before work was performed at the new rate. The service manager said he understood Harold's position and that the rate was what it was. Harold asked to speak with the dealer principal. The dealer principal's name was Ed Callaway, the son of the man who had sold Harold his first John Deere tractor in 2006. Ed had taken over the dealership 8 years earlier when his father retired. Harold had maintained the business relationship through the transition, partly out of inertia, and partly because Ed had, in the early years of his tenure, been a competent dealer principal who had kept the service operation running at approximately the level Harold required. The relationship had been adequate. It had not been exceptional. Harold had been telling himself for 3 years that adequate was enough. Ed Callaway came on the line and confirmed what the service manager had said. The rate was $121. It had been posted. He said he was sorry Harold had not seen the posting. He said the rate increase reflected the current market for qualified agricultural technicians in the region, and that the dealership had to remain competitive in its compensation to retain the staff that Harold and his other customers depended on. Harold said he understood the business rationale. He said his concern was not with the rate itself, but with the manner of its implementation. He said that a 17-year customer running a 2,400-acre operation in the dealership's primary service territory deserved advance notification before a 23% labor rate increase was applied to a service invoice. Ed said he appreciated the feedback. He said he would take it under consideration for future rate adjustments. Harold said he would appreciate that. He paid the invoice. He drove home. He was not, by temperament, a reactive man. He had farmed 2,400 acres of corn, soybeans, and hay ground in Cooper County for 38 years, and farming for 38 years in Missouri produces either a reactive man or a deliberate one, and Harold had become deliberate the way most men become what they become, through the specific education of experience repeated until the lesson is no longer necessary to repeat. He had learned that reactive decisions in farming were usually expensive decisions, and that the cost of a reactive decision was often higher than the cost of the situation that had prompted it. So he did not call Ed Callaway back that evening to express further dissatisfaction. He did not begin researching alternative equipment brands that night. He paid the invoice, drove home, and went about his week. What he did do beginning the following Monday, was keep a more deliberate record of his service interactions with Callaway equipment than he had been keeping before. Not because he had decided anything, because he had learned across 38 years that the situations that eventually required decisions were the situations that had been accumulating data for months or years before the decision became necessary, and that the men who made the best decisions were the men who had been paying attention before the moment of decision arrived. He pulled his service invoices going back 4 years from the file in his farm office. He was a systematic filer, every invoice, every service record, organized by year and by machine in manila folders that occupied 2 drawers of a 4-drawer filing cabinet. He built a simple table on a yellow legal pad: year, service event, labor rate, parts markup, total cost, and a column for notes. It took him 2 evenings to complete the table from 4 years of records. The table showed 3 labor rate increases in 4 years, from $89 per hour in 2020 to $98 in 2022 to $121 in the current year. Each increase had been implemented without prior notification. Harold had not noticed the first increase at the time. The jump from $89 to $98 had been absorbed into the variation of normal service invoices and had not registered as significant until he was looking at the full table and could see the trajectory. The jump from $98 to $121 was larger and had registered immediately, which was why he was building the table. But the pattern, 3 increases, 0 notifications, was older than the current invoice. He also noted the parts markup trend. The table showed a gradual increase in parts pricing above the manufacturer's list that had moved from approximately 8% in 2020 to 14% in the current year. This was within the range of normal dealer practice, and Harold had no particular objection to it as a business model. But in the context of the labor rate trajectory, it represented a compounding cost increase that he had not been actively tracking because he had not been looking at it across time. He set the legal pad on the kitchen table and looked at it for a while. The total cost increase in his annual service budget from Callaway equipment, comparing the 4-year-ago baseline to the current year on comparable work volume, was approximately $8,400. That was not a number that threatened his operation. It was a number that, in the context of an adequate rather than exceptional dealer relationship, asked the question he had been deferring. He did not answer it immediately. He went back to his preseason preparation. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after the invoice conversation. Harold was in his equipment shed doing a preseason check on his planter when his cell phone rang with a number he did not recognize. He almost did not answer it. He answered it because he was at a point in the planter check that did not require his full attention, and because he had a general policy of answering unknown numbers during business hours on the grounds that ignoring unknown numbers during business hours was a habit that had once caused him to miss a time-sensitive grain offer. The caller identified himself as Paul Garrett, the owner of Garrett Farm Equipment, the Massey Ferguson dealership in Montague County, 28 miles west of Harold's farm. Harold knew the name of the dealership. It was visible from the highway he used occasionally to reach a sale barn in the next county, but had not done business there and had no particular relationship with it. Paul Garrett said he was calling to inform Harold that Garrett Farm Equipment would be implementing a labor rate adjustment effective 60 days from the current date, and that the adjusted rate would be $104 per hour, an increase of $6 from the current rate of $98. He said he was calling accounts in his service area to provide advance notice of the change so that any work Harold might be planning to schedule could be completed at the current rate if Harold preferred to do so before the adjustment took effect. He said he understood Harold was not currently a Garrett customer and that he was making the call anyway because Harold's operation was in his service area and because Paul Garrett considered advance notification of rate changes a basic courtesy that he extended to any farmer who might be affected. Harold stood in his equipment shed with the phone against his ear and said nothing for a moment. Then he asked Paul Garrett how he had come to have Harold's phone number and know the size of his operation. Paul said he maintained a service area database of farming operations above 1,000 acres within his territory, drawn from county property records and agricultural census data, and that he used the database for exactly this kind of proactive communication, not to solicit business, but to ensure that farmers in his territory had accurate information about his dealership's current service terms, regardless of whether they were current customers. He said he had been building the database for 4 years, and that the call he was making to Harold was the same call he made to every operation of Harold's scale in his territory whenever a rate or policy change was coming. Harold asked how long the advance notice window was on the current change. Paul said 60 days was his standard, and that he had extended it to 90 days on the previous rate adjustment 3 years ago when the increase had been larger than usual. Harold said that was a different approach than he had encountered from his current dealer. Paul said he was not familiar with how other dealerships handled these communications. He said he handled them this way because he believed a farmer making a service budgeting decision deserved accurate forward information and not a surprise on an invoice. Harold said he agreed with that. He said he appreciated the call. Paul said he appreciated Harold's time. Harold asked one more question before he ended the call. He asked what the current loaner equipment situation was at Garrett Farm Equipment. Paul said the dealership maintained 2 loaner tractors for planting and harvest season use, available to any account above 1,500 acres with a scheduled service relationship. Harold said he did not have a scheduled service relationship with Garrett. Paul said the question had been hypothetical. Harold said it had been. He thanked Paul for the call. He stood in his equipment shed for a moment after he ended the call. Then he went back to the planter check. He thought about the call while he worked, in the background way that a man thinks about something significant while his hands are doing something familiar. 2 phone calls, 3 weeks apart. One had been a confirmation of a rate increase that had already appeared on an invoice, delivered without apology and with a reference to a posted notice Harold had not seen. The other had been an advance notification of a rate increase that had not yet occurred, delivered to a man who was not a customer, with a 60-day window for adjustment. Harold was not a man who made decisions based on a single contrast. He was a man who made decisions based on patterns, and a single data point, even a striking one, was not a pattern. But a single data point, placed alongside the table on the yellow legal pad, was the beginning of a pattern, or the confirmation of one that had been forming for longer than he had been paying attention to it. He called Paul Garrett back the following Monday morning. He said he wanted to understand the Garrett dealership's service structure and parts availability before he made any equipment decisions, and that he was not calling to commit to anything but to gather information. Paul said that was a reasonable approach and that he would answer any question Harold put to him. Harold asked 5 questions in the following order. What was the current technician staffing level and average years of experience on AGCO equipment? What was the parts distribution relationship with the AGCO regional hub? And what were the documented lead times on high-demand components? What did the loaner program structure look like in specific terms for an operation of Harold's size? What was the service scheduling window during peak planting and harvest season for accounts with a scheduled service agreement? And what happened when the dealership made a commitment to a customer and failed to meet it? Paul Garrett answered all 5 questions without deflecting any of them. His technician staff had 4 full-time mechanics averaging 11 years on AGCO equipment, with 1 senior technician at 19 years who handled major diagnostic work. The parts distribution relationship with the AGCO hub in Kansas City had produced an average lead time of 3.8 days on high-demand components over the previous 2 seasons, documented in his order logs which he offered to share. The loaner program covered 2 row crop tractors and 1 utility tractor, allocated by account size and seasonal need, with a formal scheduling system rather than a first-come basis. The peak season service window for scheduled service agreement accounts was guaranteed within 5 business days. And when the dealership failed to meet a commitment, Paul said this had happened twice in the previous 3 years. The response had been a direct conversation with the affected customer, a documented explanation of what had caused the failure, and a service credit applied to the next invoice. Harold said he appreciated the specificity. He asked if he could see the parts order logs Paul had mentioned. Paul said he would email them that afternoon. The logs arrived at 3:15. Harold printed them and went through them at the kitchen table that evening with the same methodical attention he had applied to his Callaway invoice history. The lead times were what Paul had described. There were two outliers, lead times above 10 days on specialty components, and both had been flagged in the log with notes indicating the reason for the delay and the customer communication that had accompanied it. Harold noted the outliers and noted the documentation around them. He built a second table on the legal pad, parallel to the first. Callaway Equipment's 4-year service history on the left. Garrett Farm Equipment's documented performance data on the right. He filled in what he knew and left blank what he did not yet know, which was most of the Garrett side, because Paul Garrett's dealership logs covered the dealership's aggregate performance, not Harold's specific operation, and the specific operation was what mattered. He drove to Garrett Farm Equipment on a Thursday morning in late March. Paul Garrett met him at the door and walked him through the service bay, the parts room, and the equipment lot without pressure and without a sales pitch. Harold looked at the Massey Ferguson equipment on the lot, the 8S and 7S units, the MF6S models, the utility tractors. He had operated Massey Ferguson equipment twice in his farming life, briefly, on borrowed machines during equipment transitions, and had found them competent without having formed a strong opinion of the brand. He asked about the fuel consumption data on the 8S265 specifically, which was the unit that would replace his primary 7R290. Paul pulled comparison figures from operators he had in the county. Harold asked if he could call two of them directly. Paul said he would ask their permission and call Harold back. The permission came the following day. Harold called both farmers. The conversations were direct and informative and confirmed what Paul's figures had shown without embellishing them. One of the farmers mentioned, without being asked, that the Garrett dealership had called him before implementing a rate change 2 years earlier, and that he had found the advance notice more useful than it had seemed at first, because it had allowed him to schedule a major service event before the increase, and had saved him a measurable amount on a large invoice. Harold thanked him and ended the call. He drove back to Garrett Farm Equipment the following Tuesday. He sat across from Paul Garrett at the dealer's desk and said he wanted to discuss a fleet transition. Not immediately, not for all his equipment, but beginning with his primary row crop tractor and proceeding from there based on how the first season performed. Paul said that was a sensible approach. They spent 2 hours on the numbers. The trade-in valuation on Harold's 7R290 was within the range Harold had established from current auction data, which he had compiled before the meeting because he compiled relevant data before any significant financial conversation. The pricing on the MF8S.265 was fair against the manufacturer's list. Harold went home and looked at the yellow legal pad one more time. The two tables sat side by side. Callaway's 4-year record, Garrett's documented performance. The decision was not obvious in the way that easy decisions are obvious. It was the kind of decision that a careful man makes after building the information he needs and finding that the information points in a direction he had not been certain of until the information was complete. He called Ed Callaway the following morning. He said he was planning to move his primary row crop tractor to Massey Ferguson equipment and wanted Ed to know before the trade-in was submitted. Ed asked what had driven the decision. Harold described the invoice conversation, the table he had built from 4 years of service records, and the phone call from Paul Garrett. He described the call in the same neutral terms he described everything, what had been said, what it had told him, and what the contrast with his Callaway experience had represented when placed against the existing record. Ed was quiet for a moment. He said he appreciated Harold telling him directly. He said the advance notification practice was something he had not considered implementing, and that hearing Harold describe the contrast made him think it was worth considering. Harold said he hoped Ed would consider it. He said 17 years was a long customer relationship, and that the decision to move the first machine had not been easy, and that the direction of future equipment decisions would depend significantly on whether the service experience over the coming seasons warranted expanding or contracting the Callaway relationship. Ed said he understood. Harold thanked him. He ended the call and set the phone on the kitchen table beside the yellow legal pad. Outside, across his equipment shed lot, the John Deere 7R290 sat where it had been sitting since he brought it home from the preseason service in February. It would go to Garrett Equipment next week as part of the trade. It had been a good machine. It had run his ground reliably for 9 seasons and had not cost him anything he could not justify in the context of what it produced. What it had not produced in 9 seasons was a phone call from Ed Callaway telling him a rate change was coming. That phone call had come from a different direction entirely. Harold Jennings was 70 years old. He had been farming long enough to know that the details of how a business relationship was conducted were not small things. They were the things that told a man, over time and in the aggregate, whether the person on the other side of the relationship was thinking about the relationship or only about the transaction. A dealer who posted a rate increase and waited for the invoice to communicate it was thinking about the transaction. A dealer who called a farmer who was not even his customer to say a change was coming was thinking about something larger than that. The Massey Ferguson equipment would prove itself, or it would not. One season was not a verdict. Paul Garrett's service logs would match his actual performance, or they would not. That would also take time to know. What Harold already knew, before the first machine had turned a furrow, was which dealer had called him first.